Awesome.
Speaking of Wisconsin, that's how I met Marnie. We were reading advocates. You left when, 2 years ago?
Almost 2 years ago.
Wow, it's crazy. Yeah,
been busy for you since then.
time flies. But I think, maybe four years ago, maybe 5 years ago, we kind of ran into each other, just being reading advocates. And then COVID happened and all this stuff happened, and we've just been on this mission together, and it's just been wonderful. So I'm going to get started. We are so blessed to have Marnie Ginsberg, Dr. Marnie Ginsberg here tonight. And I'm going to read her introduction, and then she's going to take it away. So Dr. Marnie Ginsberg is the founder of Reading Simplified, whose mission is to support busy, overwhelmed teachers to learn a research-based system of effective and efficient instruction that accelerates all students' reading achievement. Marnie's surprise at finding so many of the middle school students in her classroom reading well below their grade spurred a passion for finding and disseminating solutions. What followed included private tutoring, university research, the creation of an evidence-based reading program, and ultimately the development of Reading Simplified, which is an amazing. So we are honored to have her with us tonight to share out her section of the January edition of the Distinct magazine that is open indefinitely till everyone has had a chance to talk about their article. So without further ado, Marnie Ginsberg.
Thank you, Donna. I really appreciate this chance to share some ideas. Hopefully it can help some people out there. And I always learn from it as well. And also thank you so much, Zara, because this was a really big step to put this this issue together, and then to continue supporting the message getting out. So I am really excited. I'm just going to be going through what is in that article, maybe with a little more expansion. See if I can figure out how to share my full screen. Here we go. How is that?
Looks great.
And black boxes, not too many of them?
I don't see any.
Okay, great. Look, it's just going on its own. Maybe I don't want that option. Let's try this again. We're not doing slideshow. We're doing enter full screen. Okay, so the article that I wrote for the Distinct magazine in January was called Another Way: How Can One Teach Decoding Without Rules and Syllable Types? So it was in this issue of Distinct. So that's a cute little design that Zara's and her team did of that article. And I'm just going to expand upon it today. And I would love to hear questions along the way. Well, I'm going to also pause after each big principle and hopefully get some questions as we cover them. So I first want to go into a little background, because I think if you're coming at this structured linguistic literacy or speech to print linguistic phonics approach from out of the blue, it may seem like, what is this? Where's it been? And, what's the research, all that stuff. So give a little historical background. And then I'm going to talk about the three main principles that were in the article, that these structured linguistic literacy approaches first have an orientation to the alphabetic principle, not to letters, sounds in isolation. And then we'll see if we can ask questions and have a little discussion. Then the second principle is rapid exposure to the code and how it works. And then the third is cognitive strategy development by focusing on one language task at a time. So here's a little bit of the background. There's so much research. That's what we've been talking about, right? Ad nauseum with the science of reading movement. And that is exciting. But at the same time, one might wonder, well, why haven't I heard about this before? All right, I'm just going to try to move my little Zoom boxes so I can see your chat. Hold on. There we go. So let's try this again. Marnie, boxes everywhere. There we go. So you might wonder, how could we just now be hearing about it? How can you claim that it's more efficient and effective than mainstream synthetic phonics approaches? That's kind of a good question. So I think there's a little background that might help. Traditional phonics approaches have been around since the 19th century, or at least, even before that. But the things that we had established in the 19th century were carried into the 20th century. And then Orton and then Gillingham, they had a big impact around the 30s, and there was some adjustment. But really, traditional phonics has been pretty consistent for a long time. Lots of different flavors for sure. But the principles and the structures have been fairly similar. But then we had this huge discovery about how we learn to read. And it's through building on the back of oral language, particularly with the skill of drawing from phonological awareness, particularly phonemic awareness. And that was a big revolution. And yet there wasn't a lot that changed with our phonics programs. Many programs tacked on a separate phonological awareness module. Some out there still don't really have a very rigorous phonological awareness module. And so despite all of the advances in research and how the brain learns to read, few changes have been made to most phonics approaches in terms of their underlying principles and organization. This is a very broad brushstroke claim, but I think it's accurate to explain the big picture. One of the reasons that we haven't made many changes is that I put myself under that synthetic explicit phonics umbrella. We've always been fighting against whole language and then balanced literacy, and we were always right, weren't we? So if you know that you have something so much better than what's in the mainstream, then you might just think that not a lot needs to be tinkered with. David Kilpatrick emphasized this point too in 2015 in one of his books. He said the three classic approaches, whole word, phonics, and whole language, all originated long before there was any scientific research on reading development and reading difficulties. Our current approaches to teaching reading represent a repackaging of assumptions and methodologies from these three classic approaches. Yet we have extensive data that could be used as the basis of our educational practices. So he's hinting at the same thing that I've been saying, that we haven't made a lot of changes, even though we've learned a ton. And then another thing that I think it kind of helps explain why you don't see a lot of researchers writing about this program versus that program and defending program A versus program B can be explained by this quote from David Pearson. He's a very influential reading educator and researcher. And he was part of I think he was probably a grad student at the time when the first grade studies came out in like 1967. And that was big time research funded by the federal government by Bond and Dykstra. And then basically one of the conclusions of the first grade studies was like, well, it's kind of hard to tell which program is better because they just kind of threw them all in a pot. And it was more about which teacher was stronger than the program. And that was at least their conclusion of the data at the time. And so he says, by the early 1970s, we, as in the research community, had declared a moratorium on racehorse studies. In other words, program A versus program B, which gets the better outcomes. And so now we're kind of left with a lot of research that's telling us about how the brain learns to read, and research that tells us about individual principles, but what's going on in the mainstream, which is balanced literacy, and now phonics, systematic explicit phonics is getting more attention. Those are kind of outside of the purview of many researchers. So we've got balanced literacy now, and we've got systematic phonics, and what we're proposing with many of my colleagues in this distinct issue and elsewhere, we're saying maybe we can think of phonics in a new way based on the research. You could consider it speech to print. You could call it linguistic phonics. We are liking structured linguistic literacy for the times we're in. So these are the three principles that I came up with to kind of explain how a structured linguistic literacy approach could actually work without teaching rules and syllable types. Because this is a question that we get a lot. when we talk about some of the features of these programs, people will say, well, my students can't read the words without the rules or the types. And that, I'm sure, is very true in that context. But if there's a different context, is there a way that this can happen? And so I'm proposing that these 3 principles, they're not the only ones by any means, but there are pretty big reasons for why we can accomplish reading words, even multisyllable words, without phonics rules and syllable types. So we're going to just go over these the rest of the time and kind of discuss them after we get through one after the other. And the first one is orientation first to the alphabetic principle. So let's dive into that. A lot of structured linguistic literacy programs, I might call them also SLL to save time, they focus first on helping the child grasp and apply the alphabetic principle. And this is usually in the context of real words, because that's basically about the only way you can make the alphabetic principle work. The alphabetic principle is the concept that our written language is a code for sounds. So we're starting not with learning that M is although you can do that a little bit, but you can mostly emphasize the concept of how our code works. So we're saying in these SLL programs that the main thing initially is the code, and then even using the code. And Julia Lindsay just came out with a book called Reading Above the Fray, and she makes this point, basically challenging a lot of mainstream approaches. Decoding sometimes gets overlooked in phonics instruction because so much time is spent on sound spelling relationships. And I'm going to tack on in isolation. She goes on to say, I'm making a big deal out of decoding on its own to focus us on helping children know how to use sound spelling knowledge, rather. So it's the putting all the pieces together that unlocks the code and helps the sound spellings to be actually learned more easily and applied. Another perspective on this is Dan Willingham, and he writes in this book, Why Don't Students Like School, that this is like the topic of a whole chapter. We understand new things in the context of things we already know, and most of what we know is concrete. So what does the beginning reader, or even the struggling reader who's confused about the code, what do they already know? They know language. This is the basis of how our code works. And this is what our kids can be quite good at. They may know 10,000 words when they're 5 years old and they start learning how to read. This is part of a famous model of reading, sometimes called the triangle framework. You could find a version like this, very similar in language, at the Speed of Sight by Mark Seidenberg. So the kids come to us, don't they, already, if they're native speakers of English, they know meaning. They know that a cat is a furry little animal, might be a pet, and they know some about phonology because they know the difference between cat and cot and cat and sat and cat and cap. They may not have that knowledge very brought to the forefront of their mind, which is really what phonemic awareness is, but they have that system pretty firing all cylinders. And so we need to go from the known to the unknown, which is spelling or orthography. This is how the code was designed. It was designed to represent the individual phoneme mainly, not exclusively. And let's start with what they know and help them co-opt the language system to build the spelling system or the orthographic system. So again, in keeping with what Dan Willingham said, build from the known. And that really is that we take language that they already have and give them this alphabetic principle. And that's the initial insight that builds from language to print. And so we're going to be in the context of words. But this is not what a lot of our programs do, particularly for the beginner, but also for the struggling reader. They'll also often say, well, we don't know this, we don't know CH, we don't know short A, we don't know short I. And so we will study those things often in isolation. So I want you to think about a systematic phonics programs for kinder, if you know of one, not one of these SLL programs like Reading Simplified. Which week of school do they usually begin guiding children to read CVC words? like using real words to grasp the alphabetic principle. You can't really easily grasp the alphabetic principle until you're in the context of real words. Jennifer says not for 3 months. Meredith says January must be a North American or above the Northern Hemisphere. That's like, again, 3 or 4 months in. 28 weeks, 26 weeks, says Megan. A lot of people say January. So what's going on in that time period? It's a big ramp up, but still hasn't hit the alphabetic principle, because we're so worried about the letter sound relationships, which, as Julia Lindsay says, could be an overreach. So if we're thinking about mainstream phonics, which one is oriented towards the alphabetic principle? At least at the beginning. This is what I'm saying. It's orientation first towards language and orientation first towards the alphabetic principle. Well, this is mainstream phonics. Not all, but many, many programs for kinder don't start to actually decode a real 3-sound word, a CVC word like cat, until maybe the 13th week of school, which would be maybe December or January, depending on your school year. I've heard of some that can start around the 6th week, but even that's not the first orientation. Yeah. Denise says, it drives me nuts doing one letter or 2 letters in a week because the letter is helpful. We absolutely have to know the letters, but that's not what the code is based on. The code is first based on the alphabetic principle, just the insight that letters are pictures of sounds. And that's not really understood in isolation. It's much better understood in context of real words. So here's an example from Reading Simplified. And Reading Simplified is a diagnostic program, so this might represent some kids in kinder, may not represent every single one, because we would adjust accordingly. But even in the first week of school, those children would be decoding, spelling, and manipulating CVC words. That would be one of the first goals, because our goal is the alphabetic principle. Now, can they do many of them? No. Can they do it fast? Absolutely not. I'll show you an example of a teacher who's here. Thank you, Jennifer, who did this on day 3 of kinder. Then they're going to quickly get into consonant digraphs, still building and reading words. Then pretty soon they can even manipulate 4 sounds words, and maybe then they get out of short vowels and they add the R sound or the OR sound. And then 3/4 of the way through this 12-week period, they're manipulating 5-sound words. And so then they get out of short vowel world, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And they begin with words like the O sound in its various spellings. And then in a week or 2, they start with sounds that have words that have the E sound. Just one example. So the structured linguistic literacy approach is much more oriented towards the alphabetic principle, getting that code out there fast, which we'll talk about later. But this is going to make a big difference in what our kids can grasp. And one is moving from the known language and tacking on or co-opting that system and putting spelling to it. And the other is just so focused on spelling, it's hard to bring in the language system because they don't necessarily know how all this fits together. So while doing charts where you have a boot and a b is certainly not wrong, but if you focus on that first for weeks on end, and you're not in the context of words, like the example on the right, we have the word pin. How do you change it to pan? You're going to miss the opportunity to reveal the alphabetic principle, which is so important for our kids with low phonemic awareness or low exposure to literacy. So let me just move over to an example. I'm going to show you an example of a 3-year-old. He is, this little clip is like 8, I don't know, 5, it's somewhere between the 5 to 10 minute mark of his first lesson doing this activity, which we call Build It at Reading Simplified. Notice we're first orienting towards what he knows. He already knows the word map. And we're going to orient him towards how the code works, which is the alphabetic principle. And then whether he knows the letter sounds and whether he's really good at segmenting, that's really secondary. Those are essential, and we will certainly build them, but they're secondary. So let me get out of here and head over to this little video clip so you can see actually what I'm talking about. This is an example of a child an example of a child at the age of 3 with their first chance at getting the alphabetic principle. And notice how the focus is on helping him connect phonemic awareness with letter sounds, but also just to get how the code works. And if you could, if a few people in the chat could tell us that the sound's working, then that would be great. You say the word map?
Map.
Map.
Yes, it's working.
Let's stretch out the word
Thank
map. Map. You try it. Map. Nice. Do it again. Map. Nice. Okay. What was the first sound that you heard when I said, oh, you're shaking the table. Yeah. Can you scoot up a little bit? Thank you. Can you scoot up so I can see your face? The camera can see your face? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What's the first thing that comes out of my mouth when I say, and you say, map?
Map.
Yes, that's the whole word. But just what's at the beginning, right here, when I say, map? Which one of these is You got it. Now say Very nice. Now listen to the next sound. What do we hear next? Map. This is the beginning. Ah. That is great. Which one is ah? That's p. That's ah. Say ah. So look, you've already got ah. That's the beginning of the word map. Remember, we're building the word map, right?
Pa.
Well, not pa, but map. Can you say map again?
Map.
Okay, look what you got. You've got map. We need the last sound. That's ah. You got it right here. You got it. Look at it. This is ah. You got it. What's the last sound? That is right. Pa. Is this pa? It is.
Pa.
Nicely done. Okay, check the sounds. Well, remember, we're building the word map. Ah. That's great. You made the word map. Awesome. You've made the word mom and map and mop and one other word. Let's see. Look at that cute face. So that is not to show you that to say, oh, see, he's reading and next week it's Harry Potter. The whole point is that he's 3. Most times, every other program in the world would not teach him reading at all. But even if they did, they would start with, let's learn all the alphabet, maybe the letters, maybe the sounds, maybe both. But they don't start the 3-year-old, the 4-year-old, even the 5-year-old with, let's put these pieces together. And if you do, you can see, I captured a 3-year-old to show, even in the early days when not much is there, the child can figure it out. And let me show you, let's see, what was my other? Oh, yeah, here we go. I want to show you another example from Jennifer Glick. She's a teacher in Arizona. She's here tonight. Thank you so much, Jennifer. She shares her practice with us a lot at Reading Simplified. She had a curriculum that didn't want her to work at with decoding and encoding 3-sound words until the 13th week of school. But she just added this one simple little activity called Switch It, which is basically what you just saw there a minute ago with a variation. She did it on the 3rd day of kindergarten in a low-income community with a lot of English language learners. And she did it whole group on Microsoft Teams. This was during COVID. So like everything that is traditionally thought of as a challenging circumstance was there, but she was still doing it. And the kids were getting the hang of it. And so they were decoding and encoding and manipulating words within the first few weeks of kindergarten because she just added a vowel and had them move things around. So here's an example of Switch It on the 3rd day of kindergarten.
I want you to listen very carefully because here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you 2 sounds and I want you to put them in here. I want to make the word at. I am at school. I am at school. So let's listen to the sounds we hear. At. At. What sound do I need to put right here? There it is. Yes, Sebastian. Thank you. I love it. Sebastian told me I need my what's the next sound?
And she has a whole nother screen elsewhere of
Oh,
all the
fabulous,
kids.
Celeste. Fabulous. You got it, Sebastian. That's it. Very good, Andy. Yes, put it down there. Avery, which sound do we need? Yes, that's it. Wow, I want you to point to those letters and say those sounds. Ready? I know I can't hear you, but I'm watching to see if your mouths are moving. I'm watching to see your mouths moving. Ready? Show me. What is that word? Read that word for me. At. You just read a word. Yes, you just read a word. Nice. All right, listen carefully. I'm going to add a sound up here in the front. I want you to change at. Let's make it bat. Bat. I use my baseball bat to hit the ball. Bat. What sound do I need right here? At. At. You got it, Avery. Yes, Ellie. Yes. I knew you guys could do this. Yes, Sebastian. Fantastic. What sound do I need right here? Now, which one of these letters says? See, this is why we're practicing. Yes. Oh, fabulous, Joaquin. Yes. At. Got. Amazing. Amazing. All right. Ready? We're going to get tricky. I have bat. But I want to change it to say fat. My kitty Simone, she is really fat because she eats too much. I got to take away one of these sounds and put a new one in its place. How do I change bat? Good job, Andy. I see your bat. Now let's change it to fat. Santa Claus is fat. My kitty cat is fat.
So you can see she knew a few letter sounds. Her kids knew a few letter sounds. Maybe some of them didn't, but they're starting to get the concept of the alphabetic principle. They're starting to manipulate and read words in the context of real word. They're learning letter sounds in the context of real words. And someone asked to switch it, like, is it a word chain? And yes, it is a type of word chaining. We have a lot of secret sauce in it. That helps us move kids up more rapidly than some word chains. And we have some free resources at Reading Simplified if you want to see how it works in our system. So I showed that little guy. So just to show you can do it early, and you can do it even when they don't know all their letter sounds, because what are they doing right then and there? They're learning them because they're building them and connecting them to real words. And we have some pieces of research that are kind of circumstantial, but it's important to know them. So we're not just claiming that this is effective because of our own anecdotal experience. Dr. Maria Montessori has been doing this type of thing, very similar activity for over 100. Well, she started it over 100 years. You may have heard of the movable alphabet, and there's an example of it. There's some research explained in Lillard's book, Montessori, The Science Behind the Genius. And that would be like on the whole program or the whole language system. So you can't say that the movable alphabet per se is the thing, but overall, it seems to get good results. Similarly, the targeted reading intervention is a whole package deal of how to help classroom teachers teach their kindergarten and first grade struggling readers. And it's getting strong outcomes, and it's on the IES What Works Clearinghouse, and over 10 published studies have been done on it, and it continues to receive millions of federal dollars to replicate it. Now it's moving out of the original research team that was at University of North Carolina, and others are studying it because it gets good results. And what we put into that, I was just the one that helped develop it. We started with segmenting words. There's an example. It's very similar to the movable alphabet, except our tools aren't quite as cool. And it's building the concept of the alphabetic principle, even in the kindergarten first day when they're confused about how the code works. So if you want to see how fast, just something as simple as that initial build it with the 3-year-old, or the switch it with the kindergarten class online, you can screenshot this, and I'll have this also at the end to watch some videos. These are 5-minute videos where kids learn, coincidentally, they both learned 13 letter sounds in 1 week, and they got better and better with figuring out how the code works in just 1 week. So my perspective is that when we orient first towards the alphabetic principle, and we're always in the context, or almost always in the context of words, what we're going to be doing is building sub-skills more rapidly.
Next, and later.
So we're going to be
It's also
building
expected that their stories will have an ending.
letter sounds,
Second grade,
phoneme
student
awareness,
narrative
phonemic
should be able to
segmentation,
give
phonemic
details about an
manipulation
event
more
or a short
rapidly.
series of events. These details should include descriptions of actions, thoughts, or
Can you hear me? Okay.
Was that you?
It wasn't.
Oh, okay.
I just muted them.
Thank you. I couldn't find them. All right.
So builds, when you're doing this, you're going to get the skills, the sub skills that a lot of programs start with first. You're going to build them more rapidly. And so what happens is that as a secondary benefit is when you're focused from practically day one on decoding and encoding, then those become stronger muscles, so to speak. And so you're preparing the way in the next stage for pattern recognition and statistical learning. These are going to be really helpful in the next few stages as we expand the code to the kids. So that's my first big point about orienting towards the alphabetic principle. And I want to stop and see if there's any questions or comments.
You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
Cheryl is seeing struggling readers from Montessori programs who need something more intense. Absolutely. With here Reading Simplified, we fold in the activity Switch It, which is a step up from Build It, or the movable alphabet. I find it to be very essential. And then also in the next stage, you'll learn about how we teach the advanced code or the long vowels, which is actually an idea from one strand of Montessori, but it's not in most Montessori classrooms. It wasn't in the Montessori classroom that my kids went to. Sam, remember, we're trying to just give them the alphabetic principle here at first. So we might not put C and K on the board at once because that's kind of a higher level skill. We don't normally expect any early kindergarten or even early first grader to know that. So we would just not put both on the board for one of those Build It or Switch It activities. We're trying to focus first on alphabetic principle decoding, and those kinds of questions kind of come later and we get more sophisticated as the child gets more sophisticated. Jennifer says it's definitely been more effective than teaching the letter sounds in isolation. Yeah.
So I have a question. If I have a kindergarten teacher who's interested in trying new things. And so if she sticks with the program we have, because we like a lot of components of it, we use Super Kids, but she wants to incorporate something like Switch It. Would she teach a couple letters so they have some knowledge of them and then do this? Or would she just kind of start the year and just kind of see where they're at and see how they can handle it?
Both can work. If you need really, you need really just one or two letter sounds and the ability to possibly segment the first sound to be able to do Build It, which is the easier version. But he was learning. Did you notice that he did not know A or P? That first little boy who is 3. But he was learning it in that context. So someone mentioned that it's not explicit. Well, I would say that it's explicit because he learned it, or he got closer to learning it. I can't be sure that he knew it 100%, but the teacher was there to teach it to him when he didn't know it. But you're letting them first have the opportunity to demonstrate their own knowledge, and it's highly controlled. So it's not like we're throwing them again into Harry Potter. All the 3-year-old had to do was pick among 3 choices for A, M, and was it T? Matt, for the word Matt. And so I don't consider it, Deb, incidental at all. It's very controlled, but it's leaning on the child to reveal what he or she needs. You could also just very explicitly teach a traditional phonics way, have these letter sounds in isolation. But as soon as you get to 3 or 4 letter sounds, then do what Jennifer did in that video on Microsoft Teams and go straight into switching. And then they learn the letter sounds as they do the switching really fast because it's in the context of real words. Carol, yeah, having them write the letters if they're at that point, that's awesome. But for the beginner, maybe they can't. So that's why we do letter sound cards. But that's a good solution for Lindsay's problem about dealing with all the letter sound cards. We also have Switch It online, so we can get that on every child's computer, so they can maybe not have to have little cards flying everywhere. Some people like the magnets. Mel asked about letter names in Reading Simplified. We would typically do that after the sound-based decoding is established. So the letters are certainly important for knowing how to spell, alphabetize, but they're not really helpful for decoding. So we put them off to the side for the beginner or for the kid who's struggling, because that's not how the codes work. The code is organized by the phoneme, and we're going to focus on the phoneme. So I gotta keep moving, but thank you for the questions. I know there are people here in the chat that can answer them, and if not, I can answer them later. So that was our first big principle. We're going to start with the orientation first, the alphabetic principle, and that actually helps pave the groundwork for this next ambitious goal that we're going to rapidly expose kids to the code and how it works. All of these principles build on top of one another. You can't just jump into principle 2 without the advantages of principle 1 and get the same outcome. So the idea of rapid exposure to the code, one of the ways that we do it here at Reading Simplified and many other SLL programs is we organize the code by the sound. Here we have the O sound, and the child is asked to read multiple O words, but they have different spellings. So this happens really early in Reading Simplified. They're going to be able to read this because you've told them these are all going to have the O sound. And so we're again orienting towards what the child already knows. They can hear the sound O. It's not that overwhelming. This is organized one concept or one schema or one organizational system, if you will. I've heard people say, oh, that's too much. It's cognitive overload, but I don't believe it is, because it's really just one thing, multiple spellings. And we find that kids can handle this very easily, even when they're 4. So the brain is hooking. There's just one concept, O, and they're hooking that there's multiple spellings that go with that. And this organization, orienting towards sounds, was also what Louisa Moats was recommending even as early as 1998. This is a famous quote if you haven't run across it yet. One of the most fundamental flaws found in almost all phonics programs, including traditional ones, is that they teach the code backwards. That is, they go from letter to sound instead of from sound to letter. The print to sound or conventional phonics approach leaves gaps, invites confusion, and creates inefficiencies. And that's mostly what I've been trying to talk about with speech to print or SLL programs, that it's not that a traditional synthetic phonics program won't work, but it's just less efficient. And when we have kids that are behind or they're going to have learning difficulties, efficiency is really powerful. So not only are we organizing by the code, but we're also organizing it more clearly earlier on about how the code really works. So one of the problems with delaying access to this information, like O can be OA or OW, and even getting to long vowels, is that kids start to expect the English language to be a system where one vowel is one sound. So I want you guys to think of a systematic phonics program that you know of, not a structured linguistic literacy one. How many weeks or months does this program stay in what I call short vowel world, where one vowel letter is equal to one sound? A, e, ah. How many weeks? Maybe even years. What do you guys think? The chat is going so great that people are not even listening to me. I'm just kidding. Janet says 4 weeks before open syllables. Okay, that's like a long vowel example. Lindsay says in Orrin Gillingham and one flavor of it, Barton, it was months and months. Natasha, excellent. Depends on the child's progress. Could be a year. Jacqueline, 30 weeks. That's what I see a lot. When we're looking at kindergarten classroom programs, it's often 30 weeks. Some of you guys sound like you're tutors and you're interventionists, and that's awesome. So that you're going to adjust to the kids' needs. Deb, this is what I experienced most of the time, moving all the way from kindergarten, even into a few months into first grade. So what's happening there? The child has learned very thoroughly a feature of our English written language that is not true, because we spent so long at that level with just short vowels and consonants, maybe consonant digraphs, maybe not. But look at if we spend a whole year there, we're deceiving them about how the code works. There's so much more, plus there's so much more to learn. So not only do they need to understand that vowels can be more than one spelling, and that sometimes those spellings can even have more than one sound, they need to get that concept as early as they can handle it. And maybe that's part of what's up for discussion. But they also need all this information beneath the surface of the water. There's a lot of code knowledge that we're delaying because we're spending so much time here. So when we camp out in short vowel world, we're setting our students up for confusion when we get into the advanced phonics level or long vowels and other diphthongs. And it's also having a detrimental impact on how much exposure they're getting to the code, because they need to have this information to be able to read even at the typical first grade level. But a lot of the times we're holding it back until the middle to end of first grade, and some of it even to second grade. So when we camp out in short vowel world, students are kept from the true nature of our code, that sometimes one sound can be more than one letter, IGH or OUGH or OA. Sometimes it can be one sound can have multiple spellings. Sometimes one spelling, OW, can have more than one sound, as in O or OW. Also, they're missing the opportunity for statistical learning. If they don't see the pattern, if they don't see the letters more than a few times, they can't start to observe the patterns. And also, then they can't really apply cognitive flexibility if if O is always ah. But when they start to see that the sound O can sometimes be OA or OW, and then they get to OW and they see it and they say, this doesn't make sense to say don't. I'm going to say down. That's cognitive flexibility. That's a hallmark of a good reader. And quicker access to the code gives them that access. So Keith Stanovich had a really influential study in 1986 called the Matthew effects. And it packed a lot of really important research and principles and theory into it. But one of the things he said was the kids that are the so-called Matthew effects kids are the kids that get off to a good start. And by the end of first grade, they are reading well and they're off to the races. And what is the pathway? They first develop good phonemic awareness, and then they learn how to decode, and then they're reading books like Frog and Toad. Here's an example of that. This is kind of a quintessential late first grade book. Are our phonics programs preparing kids to be able to read this by mid to late first grade? If they're in short vowel world, they're not. Notice that the top 300 words are in yellow, and that makes up about 65% of writing. And there's a lot of long vowels in there: the I in time, the A in day, the E in very, the A in always, the and never. That information has to get into their hands so they can see the patterns, so they can learn these words. Now I'm throwing something kind of complex. But it's basically if you backward map from what Stanovich says we need to be able to get these kids to be good readers. And he wasn't talking about precocious, well above average children. He's saying just the kids that are going to become good readers. They're already into these texts. And how could they be into these texts if they didn't get the phonics released to them early enough that they've seen patterns and they've started to get these words to become orthographically mapped or become sight words? So let me show you an example of this. I was excited to go visit a school near Denver in December, and they had just started reading Simplified, which is obviously a structured linguistic literacy approach. And this is a first grade video I'm going to show you, and in an intervention classroom. So these are children that had been flagged for being behind, and he's in December of first grade, which is like 3.5 months in, and he's already gone through learning the O sound and its various spellings, the A sound, the I sound, and now he's at the sound, and he's reading a trade book looking for the sound. You can see that sorted sheet there, similar to the one I showed earlier. So he's gotten access to this code. He may not be ready to read Frog and Toad tomorrow, I'm not sure, but maybe by the end of the year he will be. So let's see an example, just a little snippet to see he's reading pretty well for a kid who is in intervention in December, 3 months into first grade, because he has access to the advanced phonics.
could not reach to get a drink. So he felt it.
Sorry.
Reach to get a drink. So he built
Nice fixing.
a brook mountain. Slurp, slurp, slurp.
So did you notice the advanced phonics information, the ow and mountain, the and slurp, and he did some marvelous cognitive flexibility to come up with build, because build is a whopping hard word for a kid at that stage. So that's just what's possible when you take this tack of rapid exposure to the code, but not just the code fast, but also how it is organized. He's searching for the sound. He's probably going to write the word slurp there on that sorted chart under the spelling. So another little slice of evidence for this, this overall approach. Phonographics is where I first learned how to do this type of approach. And it actually has a few really remarkable studies on it. This is a brain scan study that Simos and colleagues did in 2002. And they took struggling readers who were like ages 7 to 14, I think. And they mostly taught them phonographics. 2 kids, I think, we use the Lindemood Bell program, LIPS. And they had already been identified as dyslexia. You can see on the left column, the brain activation is not so good, because that's kind of quintessential for a dyslexic child who's still struggling, is that they're not really optimizing the brain patterns. We know that the brain learns to read best on the left side, or that we recognize words more easily on the left side. And so on the third column, you can see a lot more orange and yellow. The brain has been built up, and this was just 2 months, and their brain scans, as the title says, they're normal. And also their reading tests were normal, in the normal range. So again, this is kind of like that series of studies on the chart. It's different, but it's not, this is more powerful, but similar. It's kind of just the big picture. We don't know, was it the fact that they did something like sort it? We can't say specifically what it was, but we can say, hey, there's something a little different about this, because we don't see results this fast in other approaches. And then a similar, well, Denton has worked with Simos, and then she did this study in 2006. And all they got was 1 month of phonographics and then 1 month of Read Naturally, which is a fluency building program. They got really large effects in pseudo word or nonsense word reading, real word decoding, and some other benefits, including comprehension, moderate effects on comprehension. So it's just something to be, alert to. Why aren't we asking questions about programs that get big effects? That was another important point that David Kilpatrick made in his Essentials book. So I went through that like lightning. What are your questions about trigger happy mouse, rapid exposure to the code, and how it works?
Okay, in the chat, there's some concerns about the research. There needs to be research.
Yeah, it would be great if there was more research, but Denise, if you get confused when reading Simplified, our general approach is to make sure that you watch one video and implement immediately, and then reflect on it in our teacher's lounge. That's our cycle that helps everybody learn it. And because it is a lot, if you're just trying to listen to me like this tonight, you have to actually put it into practice. And if that still didn't work, then come back to the teacher's lounge and we'll help you. Where's the research question? I could get more, I mean, we don't have a slam dunk, but I would say we don't have a slam dunk study on any phonics program. We have relatively weak effects in some studies and some programs, and we have relatively strong effects. And so I'm pointing out the strong effects are usually in a speech to print or structured linguistic literacy approach. So maybe we should look more into that.
Oh, Deb Dunn is concerned. I still would like research studies on this approach. It's awesome that many teachers can anecdotally say it's effective. It's another to confirm that with replicable studies.
Well, that's why I want you to go look at the targeted reading intervention or go look at those studies I just covered on phonographics, because those are top quality research and they have been replicated and they're continuing to be replicated, particularly with the targeted reading intervention. I know that intimately. And there's some of the same principles.
And the other concepts that readers use, good readers use, are set for variability, correct? And I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for doing that. And isn't that true that this is now, there's a lot more research about that?
Yes. And I'm going to get into that a little bit, although not deeply. Yeah, that's a concept of, or it's a skill that kids need to have when they mispronounce a word. Do they have the skill of correcting it? Like my example of, I use all the time, if they misread the word down as don't, they have to correct that. And that skill requires that cognitive flexibility that I talked about earlier. And the two things that I've talked about so far help lead into the cognitive flexibility, which will enable kids to read read multi-syllable words. I think I should go on so I can get through the third point. And then if there's people that want to stick around after the hour, maybe we can answer those questions, but at least give everybody within an hour the big picture, if that's okay. So we talked about those two principles, and they all feed into this third principle, cognitive strategy development by focusing on one language task at a time. If you don't do the first and the second, this third one will be challenging. And we particularly think about this third principle in relationship to multisyllable words, but it's not just there. So if we've done the first two principles, then our kids, I find, is they have stronger phonological processing. They have deeper phonics knowledge. They have better understanding of the nature of our code, and they have the cognitive flexibility, like set for variability that Donna was talking about. But then people say, well, my kids can't read those multi-syllable words without, like, it's so complex. And indeed it is. But if we've done these things beforehand so that they're more sophisticated with their phonological processing and they're more sophisticated about how the code works, then they're basically more attuned to language. So now all we need to do is kind of simple to help them through multi-syllable word reading. First, we just show the chunks, like in that thing off to the side, multi-syllable. Then the child is going to read and write by chunks. So when she writes the word multi-syllable, which is not where we'd start with something simple like simple, but she would say simple. And then she would read in books. And if she can't attack the word, right, if she can't find where to chunk the word, then we would provide feedback. And the child would learn to flex the vowel, like I talked about with the down, don't example, which is set for variability. And so these are the simple steps that enable the child to attack a multisyllable word, and they don't need to know the syllable types to be able to do it. And then, of course, the teacher is guiding them to read a lot, and that is what's going to build the statistical learning so that they internalize these patterns. Now, here's an example from phonographics, like on the first multi-syllable lesson. You can see it's very clear where to stop, and that's the first step. You just model it, really. And notice it's fun-y, not fun-ny, because we're organizing by sound, not the dictionary. This is going to help unlock how the code works. And phonographics, and they quickly go into this, which is the same basic thing. You can see less, before, you know where to chunk it. So you're showing it initially, and they're reading it and they're writing it. So they would write ing as they wrote that after they read that word. And with Reading Simplified, we do it usually like this on a dry erase board with the chunks already there. And so this child is writing simple. So she's got the model, and now she's starting to internalize where we break these funky things. This is from phonic books and early on in one of their programs, laptop. And I bet they have the kids say the sounds as they write them in chunks or in those syllables. After that modeling with them chunked, then you get into real books. And if the child doesn't know where to break it, that's fine. There's a good long set of weeks where we're just going to break it up for them like this: consecutive. So I can't remember where I have a little video, but I think it's coming up soon. So this is all that it takes. If you have that foundation that I talked about at the beginning of the hour, then all you have to do is teach the kids to blend the chunks together, verify that the word is meaningful and fits the spelling. And then if not, then they have to flex the vowel or use that set for variability skill. But in contrast, a mainstream phonics program might require at first you learn a lot of phonics rules or syllable patterns. And then you have to, when you see a new word, recall which applicable pattern fits. Then you have to apply it. Then you kind of get into the same thing we did on the right. You have to blend the syllables together, verify that the word is meaningful and fits the spelling, and try again if not. So those last 3 steps are a part of every program, most likely, but we just find that we don't have to do the beginning parts because the phonological system and the orthographic, basically phoneme grapheme relationships is so much stronger. And we're in real reading so much earlier and so much more practice of it, they can start to internalize these more easily. So here's another way of looking at what's going on. In a structured linguistic literacy program, I think we're more likely to be focused mostly on that triangle framework, mostly focused on language and written language. But in some mainstream phonics programs, you have to do both. You have to think first, what a rule applies here, apply it, and then you have to get into the language system on the, where did I go? Got a trigger happy mouse. So you're adding another language task, another set of steps that can be burdensome for some children. Natalie says she used to teach a Norton Gillingham approach, and now she found some challenges. And now she says, I talk less, a faster response time from the student, less stress on the student, and my students are empowered when we flex it. That's what we call the set for variability at Reading Simplified. So I want to show like the super fast example of set for variability or flex it. In this example, this little boy is going to read that word colonies. He's going to read it first as colonist. And I think that's when I start to point at it. So he then goes back and tries again. And he says colonize, which is a reasonable option, but he knows that's not a word. So then he flexes it into colonies. This is not an example of the whole package of what we're talking about, but it is an example of the importance of really strong phonological processing and putting the burden on the child to flex it so that when they move through 3 sound words to 5 sound words to simple multi-syllable words and all the way up to words like colonies, they have the necessary skills. So here is a super short clip of, I think he's a 4th grader who's got dyslexia working through the word colonies with support. Wait a minute, I'm not sure I did the right button. Let's try this again. Yep, I did. Sorry. Colonies. Where's colonies? Okay, here we go.
The independent Declaration of Independence. It states that the colonists. It stated that the colonists no longer belonged to England.
Except it stated that the
colonies no longer belong to England.
Have you heard of the Declaration of Independence? He went on his own from colonize to colonies. That's set for variability because he mispronounced it. It wasn't a real word, didn't make sense. And he fixed it on his own. All I was doing was pointing with a pencil. And that's basically a cognitive flexibility that was enabled by the things that came before. So I wouldn't say that this series of steps would work for a 5th grader who's struggling if you don't do some of the preliminary things that we've talked about, because that's all very foundational. But once you've built in some phoneme grapheme processing skills, like with activities like Switch It, then those 3 steps are doable and the kids can pick it up. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I know I'm not really giving a full picture because it's complex. So much of what we're talking about looks the same at certain points. It's just a matter of when and how much and what's left out. And so it can be hard to really get a full picture. So if you want, for instance, to look more into how we do readings, we do multi-syllable reading, you could take a screenshot of that web address, or just Google multisyllable words reading simplified and you'd find it. But just to reiterate, I think that these three principles explain why a person can learn to read without phonics rules and syllable types. These aren't the only reasons, but these are some really powerful things that we've seen in both Reading Simplified and the Targeted Reading Intervention, which I know really well, and phonographics, and a lot of other programs like Sounds Right and Ebley and Abecedarian. I incorporate most of these principles as well. So really, I think it kind of sums it up by saying we're really leading with the language system. Every speech first, language first is what enables us to begin with explicit instruction and then rely more and more on the child's implicit ability to pick up patterns of statistical learning. Their brain is really amazing. And that's what enables us to get really fast outcomes with Reading Simplified and other structured linguistic literacy approaches. So maybe we should get into some of those questions now, because I know I covered a lot of ground.
We have some really good questions. I can understand why folks are feeling a little uncertain about this. I, for one, was one of them. But it really makes sense if you think about where you're going to use speech first. Always go with the speech. So let's go back. We have some questions. And Jennifer's been kind enough to answering some of them.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay. If they flex the vowel to figure out the word, how can they know if they are saying it correctly if it's an unknown word?
Well, a lot with Reading Simplified, I try to build a system where there's more opportunities for the teacher to listen to children and give them feedback. So that's the first thing. This is how much time is in a typical class where teachers listen to kids, and this is how much time we try to get teachers to listen. So there's a lot more opportunities for feedback, and that is so important. Secondly, remember, we're building off of the language system. So it's probably true that they have heard that word before, because we know there's different levels of knowledge of vocabulary in your own language. There's some words that you have heard the sound of them, but you don't know anything about the meaning. And that may be the case. You come across, I have a video, it's kind of amazing, I happened to get this on video, and I think it was the word judicial, same kid that was in that video a minute ago. And he reads the word judicial, again, with help and flexing it. And he figures out, oh, judicial? And I say, yeah, do you know what that means? Nope. He had no clue, but the sounds of the language, the rhythm of the language, the shul at the end, those are things he had pieces of. And so, or maybe he'd literally heard the word judicial before. And so he figured it out. Now, and then sometimes they're not going to read the word right and they're not going to pronounce it right, but that would happen in any program, because there's no rule that will work 100% of the time by any stretch of the imagination. So we still need to be listening, still need to be expanding their oral language by read alouds, rich discussions, and lots of opportunities for them to practice. There's some really cool technologies coming out now where they can read to the computer, and the computer could give feedback. So it's an extra opportunity for that feedback. But we probably all have had words that we find out like in our 20s or 30s or 50s, like, oh, that's how you say that word,
Right. Exactly.
I remember a friend in college thought it was intensive purposes. Like, he hadn't read for all intents and purposes before. So the first time he saw it, he thought, oh, when people have been saying that, I always thought it was intensive purposes, like really hard, intense purposes. That's just one example that comes to mind.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is just a comment. My kiddo's school uses a linguistic phonics program very similar to Reading Simplified. They don't bother to use syllable rules or many spelling rules. They focus on patterns. Once they hit long vowel sounds and affixes, They group their weekly spelling list by spelling patterns. That is a list of OA words one week, a list of O-E words the next. My kiddo is dyslexic, but in the 95th percentile in spelling on standardized.
Wow.
And the entire school is well above the national average in spelling. Amen.
It sounds like a good strategy. Once you've taught them how to use sound-based decoding, they get they have the understanding of how the code works, and then you're diving back into orthographic patterns that may be harder to pick up if they haven't picked them up again. So grouping them that way, that's smart.
Then there was another question about how do you know what grapheme to use? If it's, all the long O patterns, which one?
Yeah. So with Reading Simplified, we do that sorted activity with the O, like OA and OW. We do that in kindergarten, usually even before December, depending again on the class. And so it's really a decoding activity. So they see all the words. They're not expected to have memorized yet the spellings of those words so that they can apply it to spelling. Because reading precedes spelling ability. So we push rapidly ahead in reading, and much later will spelling come along. So we all learned how to spell the word boat as opposed to the word snow by decoding the word, decoding it several times. Then it turned into a sight word, or we orthographically mapped it. Then we read it several times because it was instant reading for us. And probably later we learned how to spell it. We might have learned it somewhere along that in those fourth and fifth step because we used it in our writing and we got corrected, or it was on a spelling test. But we're just trying to, again, back to the access to the code and get them into text like Frog and Toad that was in that slide. We're trying to get them into reading those really quickly so they can start to understand the patterns of our written language, so they can build a large sight word vocabulary rapidly. They can become fluent. They'll read widely. And when you read Magic Treehouse in the end of kinder or middle of first grade, how to spell boat or snow is not really your big problem. Like, you're not as worried about that. It's going to come along, especially if you have good supportive spelling instruction and you have good writing instruction, but it's secondary to just the flood of words and phonics information that those kids can have, because that was really leading with decoding.
Okay, here's a question. One of the hallmark markers of dyslexia is a deficit in phonological awareness. If you are relying on their implicit ability in this area and it is a weakness, what do you suggest?
Well, remember those first two principles actually throughout. We are always building up the phonological system. We start day one with that build it activity, when that little boy who was 3, what do you hear at the beginning of Matt? What do you hear next in Matt? So that's one activity. When they get to the next stage where they're writing a word and they're writing maybe the word cat, they were going to say the sounds k, at. They're going to always be practicing segmenting. With Switch It, and they're changing cat to cot and cot to pot and pot to pit. They're changing the letter sounds, and they're practicing phoneme manipulation. When they get to the Sort It and they're writing the word snow, they're going to say S-N-O. So everything folded throughout a structured linguistic literacy approach is developing the phonological system. So it's not a weakness, but pretty quickly for even the dyslexic kid, they may be slower. It does take longer for them to orthographically map things, but it's something that we target explicitly, because that's mainly in English. That's the main reason kids don't decode accurately. Later on, for sure, if they're not noticing these patterns, then we can study them in depth, as one of your one of the guests mentioned. So you can study them in more depth so that it becomes more blatant. And notice, like there's some implicit learning involved, but it's not like it's random. Like with the O sound, we're studying in Reading Simplified, we're studying high frequency O sound words like to know something, or go, or show, or road, or we throw in toe because it shows the OE pattern. But that is going to help those words that are high frequency words get orthographically mapped, because they're doing phonics knowledge, decoding, and learning high frequency words all simultaneously.
Here's one. How does Reading Simplify handle high frequency words? Do you explicitly model OM? I'm not sure if it's high frequency words or what would you call those, non-regular words?
Yeah, almost every word we teach the same way. So it's just that maybe you have to put more explanation into the OE pattern in come. Did you see how when he read the word, I can't remember what word he said, but he read, I think one of the last videos, he misread the word stated, and the teacher tapped at the A and the E. So if a child reads the word come as comb, or maybe they say come, I might just tap the O and the E, which is the same thing we do for A, separated E, or magic E, or silent E, or, IE and kite. Help them notice that this is this thing in that word that we're going to put together. The O and the E together are a sound. Okay, then they come up, maybe they say comb, whatever they say. Well, that's not a word. What else could it be? Is one thing you could do, which again helps build the cognitive flexibility. If that doesn't work and that's too hard for them, then we would just tell them, in this word, it's not what you expect. It's kind of unusual. This is a, and I tap the O and the E. This is a. Try again. Come. Yeah. It's like the word some. See that you learn, you already know the word some. Let's write these two words. So it's it can be something you teach explicitly beforehand if you're in a small group or a whole group and you need to do that, or it can be dynamically responsive to the child's need. If they read it without your help, then just let it go. Keep going.
Well, and then doesn't that also feed into, there's orthographic, phonological, orthographic, and meaning processors. The meaning processor has to be tapped.
Yes.
If they're reading
right,
come to the store, they would, and said comb to the store.
Right.
That's going to trigger. That doesn't make sense. I mean, right?
Exactly.
So those are the three processes that should be ongoing while someone is reading.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Okay. Reacted to, okay, when do you move on? I'm telling you, we've got tons of questions here. I don't know when we want to cut it off, but let's try to go through it. Okay, let's see. When usually, we got people helping you answer. Okay. Okay, how long do you recommend spending on CVC words? How can you be sure it's time to move on to blends in the next skill?
In Reading Simplified, we actually don't go to blends in the next skill because of that slide that I showed you with Frog and Toad, because the top 300 words are 65% of written language. That's what you need to be able to have to read Frog and Toad, Little Bear, or Messy Bessie. And there are very few 4 and 5 sound words in the top 300 words. But there are I think there's 37 words that have the E sound, as in many or any or each. And there are 27 that have the sound, as in never, ever, every, mother, father. So we go, I don't know of any other structured linguistic literacy program that does this. I didn't do this in the targeted reading intervention, but we go straight from, you can blend 3 sound word about 70% of the time, which means you know how to blend. You're not solid at it, but you got the hang of it. Those short vowels are coming online. And so now we're going to get into below the surface of the water with that iceberg image, because there's so much information that needs to be unlocked to be able to figure out how the code works. And it's just a lot of info. So the earlier you can get to it, the better equipped they are for those top 300 words, and then they can get into really transitional texts and chapter books quickly. Other programs would probably go straight from CVC to blends, but again, they might be able to do it faster because of this focus on, in the context of words, the alphabetic principle, building the phonemic awareness skills of segmenting, blending, manipulating in every activity.
Okay, let's see here. Oh my gosh, there's so many here. All right, we're gonna stop, I think, in a few minutes.
And I see one. Denise asked a question about, if using the flex the vowel, how do you handle the universal benchmark assessment like DIBELS that tests nonsense words? We're not saying that, you still don't want to aim for a standard. We're just saying that flex the vowel or set for variability is the skill that helps the child develop more and more knowledge of the code. So what happens if you're decoding successfully and you get feedback from the teacher, you start to observe these patterns, and you do observe the pattern that some programs call like closed syllables. And so that they know that this vowel is supposed to be a short vowel. But most of us who are adult readers to this day didn't learn to read by labeling an open and closed vowel, a syllable. We learned that subconsciously. So there is implicit learning that happens. Even for our struggling learners, we might need to make it very, very blunt. Like, here's a whole bunch of words with short vowel, a, and here's a whole bunch of words with long vowel a, and have them sort them. And so this pattern starts to become really, really clear if it hasn't become clear to them. So you can still make it an explicit lesson for that, but they will get basically these foundational skills, get them to the same place. And I just think they get them there faster so that they would be able to read a nonsense word in dibbles. My experience as a tutor, when I used phonographics and then the targeted reading intervention and then reading simplified, was my kids could read word attack. They would do this Woodcock-Johnson word attack. After 12 hours, they would be well above grade level on that. That's actually the fastest thing I can move with a kid. Word identification, because it requires the orthographic mapping of some irregular words, like the Woodcock-Johnson probably includes the word enough and laugh and things you just have to have seen several times and decoded accurately. And so that sometimes takes a little longer to get to grade level. But those decoding skills, when you lean on the system that's already there, the language system, and then just co-opt that for understanding print without burdening with a lot of other information, it actually happens quite fast that they can get that knowledge. Is this a long vowel or short vowel? Maybe they don't even label it that way, but they know how to apply it when they see it in a nonsense word.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just see it as it just cuts to the chase. Like they don't have to go through that step of, is this a closed syllable or open syllable? It just makes it so more natural. I think the speech part, it's language. That's what it has been. That's my observation. Okay, we have one more question and then we're going to call it quits. And I can't remember where it is now. It was just at the end. Oh, is there a specific title for the first 300 words in order to take a closer look? Are you referring to the Fry words?
It doesn't really matter. You could look at Fry. You could look at Devin Kearns. He has a more updated list, but it's all going to be very, very similar. So I wouldn't let that worry you. Just use what you have on hand, but you can Google Devin Kearns. His last name is Kearns, and he has a nice list. Reading Simplified, I developed that 2013 through 2015, and I didn't have that, and so I used Fry at the time, and his is a little old, but it's still, they're very similar. There's only a few differences, and if a word is on the Kearns list but it's not on the Fry list, it's because it's 305 on Fry and 299 on Kearns, and so it's not really something to get too worked up about. You probably have a gut, if you've been teaching reading for a while, you probably have a gut sense of whether it's a high frequency word. And back to kind of that frog and toad example, like what are the words that just pop up over and over there, or in the Dr. Seuss book? Those are the words that are high frequency that our kids need to know in a split second, and they need advanced phonics knowledge to be able to unlock those words.
All right, I promise this is the last question. Is there a scope and sequence?
With Reading Simple, I mean, yeah, every structured linguistic literacy program that I know of has a very clear scope and sequence. Reading Simplified has ours. You can see a sample of what we would use for those at the kindergarten level. If you go to readingsimplified.com and then go to the Start Here button, you can download our, we call it a streamlined pathway. It's just one page for all of phonemic awareness, phonics, sight, and high frequency words for kinder.
Okay. Whew. That was great.
We didn't cover a lot of ground or anything, did we?
No. I think we're going to need like a little mini series. Maybe we'll talk about that, Marnie. I think that's in order.
I would love
All
it.
right, thank you. We had a really good turnout tonight, 175, 77 people actually, which is, I'm glad I upped my account over 100. So this is good. Appreciate everyone coming. Next month, I don't remember who our guest is, but watch for the notice.
Be on the
Okay?
lookout. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for being here, you guys. Thanks
Yeah,
for teaching.
sure.
Will the recording be sent out soon?
Yes, it will. It will be a couple days because my husband's not home and he gives me all the people that registered, so I can't access that.
Okay, when I registered, this went on my calendar for 5 p.m. California time, so I just showed up
Bummer.
15
I'm
minutes
sorry.
ago.
Oh, no worries. We got you covered.
Yeah, I don't know why that happened because I took it right from the invite and had it sent to my calendar and it put it in there at 5 o'clock my time.
That's weird.
Which if you're Central Time, that should be 5 o'clock my time because I'm Pacific Standard.
It should be 4
It was
o'clock your
4
time.
o'clock your time. It was 5 mine and I'm in Mountain. But it is weird that yeah, sometimes the computers are
Okay,
not our friends.
I gotta pay more
Yeah.
attention. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. All right. I think we're good.
Okay. Thank you, Donna.
Oh, thank you. I'm gonna